Okay, awesome. Well, welcome everyone to the DocSIG webinar series, the ongoing series here. And today we're going to be talking about networking in academia. For those of you that are new to this format, my name is Louis Zmick and I'm the chair of DocSIG. We've got a bunch of other DocSIG members that are here in chat, so maybe they can go ahead and make their acquaintance at some point. But essentially, DocSIG is the political / resource arm of AMA. We're one of the special interest groups that aim to help doctoral students with both resources, funding, and information related to the marketing field. And so we're really excited here to have Dr. Hamilton present to us. But before I pass it off and introduce him, I do want to mention that this year, Winter AMA is doing something a little different. So it's split up into two parts. Part one is virtual Winter AMA, which is the 10th and 11th of February. And then part two is in Las Vegas, and that is from the 18th through the 20th. So the PDF that I am putting in chat now is just a streamlined version of what we have going on. We have some pre-conference events, the one that you're at now, and then we do have another one on developing research topics. We will then have a virtual session panel talking about what is a contribution, how to make a contribution with your research, and then we'll have the in-person sessions, dinners, and other special interest sessions at AMA. So if any of that is of interest to you, you can always reach out to me. Here's my email. And Kevin, who is the chair-elect, was out sick, so he is not here today. But both of us will be willing to answer any and all of your questions. So moving on to today's presentation, Kevin actually had made this connection between DocSIG and Dr. Hamilton. We were thinking about what should we do to bridge this webinar series into Winter AMA, and we thought it was absolutely perfect to talk about networking, because as young faculty, as doctoral students, networking is something that is immensely important, and it helps bring on future colleagues to research projects. It helps you expand your own network. We heard countless times of people getting jobs, bouncing from one job to another, finding their dream job, all through networking and the power of networking. And so Dr. Hamilton here from Emory is going to talk to us about the power of networking, how to network, and answer some of our questions. What I will say is if you could, to leave yourself muted throughout the presentation, to submit your questions via chat. I will then collect them and we'll answer them either throughout the presentation or at the end when you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question if that works. And so without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Hamilton, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So it's a pleasure to be here with you. When Kevin told me in class that he was a part of the leadership of DocSIG, I said, well, let me know if I can help, because I'm a big believer in the good that group does. I very much appreciated the information and the advice that I got through DocSIG when I was a student. And so I'm glad to see so many people are involved in it, and I hope you're all getting a lot out of it. So I was asked to talk about networking, which is hilarious because I do not consider myself a networker at all. In fact, I'm mildly hostile towards the concept, which makes me the perfect person to talk to you about this. I was confused when Kevin invited me to talk about this topic specifically. And I asked him, I said, well, like, why would you think that I'm a good networking person to talk to? And he explained it to me, and after he did, it made some sense. So Kevin was in my consumer behavior PhD seminar this fall, and the way that we organized the semester is that we had in a bunch of guest speakers. So every week we'd read a set of papers, and then one of the authors of one of the papers would zoom in for the last half an hour and tell us the backstory and explain where the idea came from and let us know how it connected to other things. And so from Kevin's perspective, so these were all of the people who participated in that. So from Kevin's perspective, here was I and Morgan Ward, who co-taught the class with me. Here we were just like pulling in all these people from all of these schools. And so from his perspective, he's like, oh, wow, like you've got a network. Like this is a lot of people that you know and can draw on for favors. And when he framed it like that, I understood. I'm like, okay, I can see where you're coming from. That's not how I saw it at all. Right? These are just friends of mine. Right? And so as we're going to talk through networks and what they are and how they can help us and what they can do for us, you're going to see that I'm going to be tilting us pretty far in the direction of kind of a humanistic relationship approach to networks and away from networking as it's typically talked about. Because I'm not convinced, especially in our field, which is a little unique in some ways, that traditional networking does as much good. I think that making friends does us a lot of good. And so that'll be the perspective that I'll bring to us as we talk through this. So I'm a theoretician, I'm a research guy, so I tried to kind of think about this from a high level research perspective. Oh, I should have started with this caveat. So we've got an hour or so to talk here. I don't have an hour's worth of material. So I've got like 15, 20 minutes of advice as far as I could time this out beforehand, which means this is going to be real short unless you guys generate questions. So as I'm going through, drop the questions in the chat box. If I notice them or if they're pressing, we'll address them. At the end, we'll have lots of time to talk. So please be thinking of questions that you have, ways that this can be applied to you. There will definitely be time for that. All right, so when I was trying to think about professional networks and networks for us, I tried to group them in a couple of different ways. So there's one group of networks, and this was already actually referenced a little bit by Lewis and Will, I know came up in some of the questions that were submitted before. You've got a network of what I'm calling senior colleagues. These are people who are ahead of you in your profession. If you're a student, these are people who are already faculty, and it can up to and include very senior people in the field. There's another group that I'm calling peers. So as a student, I would consider your peer group to be other students or very junior faculty, people who've just been out for a year or two, but for whom you've overlapped in kind of that student bracket. And then there's a third group that I'm going to define here for us that I will call close friends. And you'll see the way that I strategically have drawn these circles. I think for most of us, as we start off, our peer network is going to be much larger than our senior colleague network. I think that our close friend network can span both of those, but it's mostly going to be drawing from our peer network. All right, we're good so far? Does that kind of make sense? This is not based on any kind of research. This is just my own way of thinking through the different groups of people that we might interact with and associate with. And I'll come back to this in a second. You could divide this further in your own way, right? Maybe you would consider senior colleagues at your institution to be a separate network from senior colleagues in the field as a whole, right? So there are various ways you could split this out. There's nothing magic about this, but it gives us a framework for talking about it. All right, so these three groups, we'll come back to them. Part of the reason it's useful to think about the different groups within your network, or if you want different types of network, comes around to this idea that grew out of anthropology and has been looked at by some sociologists and psychologists. A lot of it was built around some initial research by this anthropologist named Dunbar. So you may have heard of Dunbar's number. And the idea is that we all have kind of these concentric circles of networks, if you want to call them that, these groups of people that we know and associate with. And there seem to be, Dunbar argued, there seem to be kind of upper limits on how many of these we can manage. Well, and so if you get beyond, and that meaningful contact group, that 150, that's come to be known as Dunbar's number. And he's found proportional numbers in his study of various ape and chimp species. In humans, it seems to be around 150, and they found evidence for it in all kinds of different things about the size of people's networks, video game networks, like online multiplayer video game networks, how many Christmas cards people tend to send out every year. If you get beyond 150 or so, it's hard for people to kind of keep track and maintain those relationships. People just don't seem to know each other as well. Some companies have taken this very seriously, where they will only have groups within their organization of 150 or fewer. And if it gets beyond that, then they'll subdivide the group out so that everybody knows each other, information flows better. Because you're all researchers, I will pause here to point out that there are people who push back on the Dunbar number. There are people who say that statistically it's not as easy to justify as Dunbar makes it out, but there's actually wide variance around that. For me, the more important insight, though, is that there is a number, right? There's some cognitive and emotional limits on how many people we can kind of know and keep track of and trust. Whether that number is 150 or 250 or 100, it's out there somewhere. So in terms of thinking about networks of people, there are just limits to how many people we can kind of usefully know and track and care about. And that closer relationships, these tighter networks, are going to be smaller because they require more of an investment from us. Right? So we've got this idea that we've got these multiple networks that kind of we keep track of. There are limits in terms of how we can kind of manage them and deal with them. I'd like you guys to pop into the chat here. Now let's kind of think about the theory of networks. Why do we care? So what is it that networks buy us? Like why was I asked to do this session at all? Like what is it that we hope to get out of networks? One was mentioned already, like we're hoping that our network will potentially be able to help us get a job, right? So that would be one benefit of networks. What else? Just type them into the chat box there. Why do you care about a network? Why should you bother to sign in or watch this later? Generating new research ideas. Khalid, to stay sane. That is actually a really important one. Publishing opportunities. Arwen, what do you mean by that? You can unmute or type your answer then.
Basically, building on what Benjamin said, working with other people. So,
great. Yeah, so research collaborations, excellent. Job opportunities, good. Connecting with other people, pooling resources, that's a great one. Feedback, excellent. Becoming aware of stuff that's going on, that is also a very, very good one. Changing perspective, I like that. Development of ideas. Yeah, having somebody to kind of commiserate with you, to know what you're going through. Accountability, that's also a very good one, right? So somebody who can kind of check on you. It can also be accountability through kind of shared action. If people in your network are kind of publishing at a certain rate, then that'll encourage you to publish at a certain rate to kind of keep up with that. So that can be good. Learning opportunities, complementary skills, these are all great. Okay, so making friends, excellent. I created a list. It overlaps a lot with the one that you guys generated here. I would suggest that it's worth you considering. Like, what is it that you hope to get out of your network? Why do you care? So these are some of the ideas that I came up with, and you'll see a lot of overlap here. Research collaboration, resources, and advice are three that tend to come up easily and frequently. Like when we think about a network, this is part of what we think about. So a lot of our co-authors will be people that are from our kind of network. Usually your co-authors don't just fall out of the sky. There's somebody that you have some kind of relationship with at some level, usually. Resources, and I've defined that very broadly. Friendly reviews, somebody that you can ask for, to share teaching materials with you. All of these are resources that are available within networks. Advice and feedback, personal advice, like kind of work-life balance stuff you go to your network for. Professional advice, how to manage your career. Research advice, like, do you know how to do the latest type of analysis that everybody's talking about? Teaching advice, how do you handle a student who does that? These all tend to be things that we turn to our networks for. Here are some others that may or may not have occurred to you. A lot of the invitations that you will get to speak at other seminars, to participate in conferences at various levels, not always, sometimes, somebody just wants to talk to you because of your publications and your CV, but a lot of times it's people that you've met and know a little bit about who invite you to do stuff. Somebody mentioned this already, but I think that like gossip, and I don't mean that in a malicious sense, but just kind of what's going on in the field. What are people talking about? What do people care about? There's usually no official publication that sends that out. We hear about that through our networks. Promotion, and by that I mean somebody who can be a hype man or hype woman for you, somebody who's out there talking you up. So when you are mentioned in conversations, they go, oh yeah, I know that person and they're great. Or, you know, somebody's talking about some field of research and somebody goes, oh, you know who's doing work in that area that's very interesting is this person. That tends to be somebody in your network as opposed to somebody who's just heard of you. This one was also mentioned, and it's super important. Comfort and commiseration. When I was on the job market, I had a tight network of other students who are on the market at the same time as I was. And even though intuitively you might consider those people your competition, that was not the way I thought of them. And that was not the way that we helped each other. It was much more around, you know, that's a very stressful time, and just kind of knowing that other people were going through it and kind of being able to trade notes and share experiences was very comforting. And then finally, socialization and enjoyment, which was also mentioned. Okay, good. We could create a longer list, right? There's lots of stuff that we could get, but this is helpful. One thing that people think that they need a network for is their first job. You get a lot of pressure when you're a student to network, specifically because you need to go on the market. And so we want you to know people beforehand. I'm going to have a lot of opinions in this presentation that may not coincide with the opinions of other people in the field, and that you may get other advice on. My own opinion is your first job out usually has very, very little to do with your network. I think because of the formalized way that we hire for rookies, where everybody goes to AMA and then everybody kind of interviews at the same time, and there are all these deadlines for. I don't think that your network is providing you with secret information about who's hiring and when, because everybody goes to hire at the same time. And I personally just do not believe that strong network connections make that much of a difference for your first job. I think because everybody's evaluating all of these packets next to each other, it will be a very rare case indeed where a weak CV will be overcome by having a strong network, or that a strong CV will really kind of be negatively impacted because the person doesn't have a strong network out there. So again, you'll find people who disagree with me on this, but my own opinion is that first job out, the thing you guys are stressing about all the time, I'm not convinced that you need to stress about it through the lens of networking. I don't think it matters. Now, your second job, on the other hand, I think networking plays a bigger role in that. So some schools, when hiring for advanced assistants or associate or full professors, will go back out on the formal market, just like when they're hiring rookies, and it'll be very similar. But for a lot of schools, the way that they hire non-rookies is through networks, where people just say, hey, who's good and who's movable, right? We've got a slot for an advanced assistant. Who do you know that's good and that might be willing to move to where we are? So I'm not going to discount that networks are important for you professionally, but if you've got a lot of pressure on you right now, thinking like you need to get out there and meet people and you need to create these networks so that you'll be okay when you go on the market, for good or ill, our market is really weird for rookies. And I think part of the good of it is that it does reduce the importance of these network effects, in my opinion. All right. So let's go back to this. All right. So we've got now a list of benefits. We've got different types of these networks that are out there. I'd like to now marry these two ideas. So we've got these different kinds of networks. We've got these different kinds of benefits. Which benefits are associated with each type of network? So I've made a table. And everything on this table is purely subjective. This is based on my own experience and based on my own opinions. Your mileage may differ. So when it comes to research collaborations, which of these three is most important to you? Now, you'll be able to answer that for yourself, how you anticipate that will be. I can tell you how it has been for me so far. So when it comes to research collaborations and co-authorships, my peer network has been the biggest source of benefit to me, even more than my close friend network. So now, different people are different. There are people who co-author a lot with their very best friends in the field. My own experience has been that when I should say I like all of my co-authors. They're all wonderful people and I get along very well with them. But I also would consider that for many of my co-authors, we have this fantastic working relationship where we have very similar research interests. We have very compatible kind of styles of writing and doing research. We have complementary skills. And that makes for this amazing co-author relationship. Whereas I also have my kind of more social friends. And there have been many times where I've sat down with some of these close friends and said, look, you're brilliant. I love your research. Why don't we get something started? And just for me personally, those have never taken off. Like we'll brainstorm and we'll come up with some ideas and just won't get anywhere. And I think a lot of it has to do with some of my close friends have different research interests than I do, right? And so it's just hard to kind of force those together. So that was surprising to me looking back now on my career, is that the network that was most valuable to me was kind of this looser, kind of a slightly farther out peer network, as opposed to like my very best social friends that I hang out with at every conference. In terms of resources, close friends, right? So if I need teaching materials, if I'm teaching a new topic, the people that I go to, my close friends. And then beyond that, my peer network. Now, I could potentially approach senior colleagues. I typically don't, and I typically haven't in the past. And so in terms of usefulness of that, advice, senior colleagues have been out longer. And so usually, now there are exceptions to this, but some specific kind of advice, I might seek out, peers or close friends before senior colleagues. But, if I want somebody's advice on like, what I should do to prepare for my tenure packet, well, that's going to be much more useful if it's somebody who's already been through tenure and has already evaluated things on the other side of that for many years. So for advice, senior colleagues, invitations to stuff, close friends, and then peer networks usually. Gossip and news, your close friends are who you're going to find out what the latest stuff is going on. Promotion, your close friends are the ones who are hyping you up to other people. Comfort and commiseration, socializing and enjoyment. Again, no diss on senior colleagues. They can be very fun people too. But usually when you're hanging out with people, it's people kind of in your own stage. And then of course the people that you're very close to. First job, again, as I've argued, I just don't think that your networks matter here. Other people may disagree. I just don't think that they do. For your second, the people who you will go to find out if any schools are hiring, and the people who will approach you to let you know that schools are hiring, those will tend to be your close friends. All right, so why did I go through this exercise? Well, go ahead and drop it in the chat here. Like, what should you take away from this table? What's the point of this? What am I wanting you to get away from this? Felix was actually answering a different question, but since Felix's is the last answer in there, we're going to give him credit because that's actually the answer to this question too. When you approach networking, in my opinion, your end goal should be to develop a network of very close friends. And that will almost certainly come through your peer network. Right? So a lot of people approach networking with the idea that we need to get to know these senior people in the field, right? These people who are very experienced and powerful. We need to know the journal editors. We need to know the senior people at these schools that I want to eventually work at. In my opinion, and in my experience, those senior networks, the senior colleague networks, are not anywhere close to as useful to you as your close friend networks are. And then your peer networks will tend to be second most useful. Questions about any of that? Thoughts? Okay. All right, so I forgot to animate that arrow. Pretend that's not there. So let me get into the advice portion of the slides that I've got here. My advice is on networking is to don't network. when people go into a situation thinking that they want to network, it can feel very predatory. It can feel like, oh, I need to capture this person and put him in my network. People can sense that you want something out of them when you are approaching them with the idea of somehow getting them in your network so they can be useful to you at some point in the future. So don't do that, right? I'll give you some ideas of what you should do instead, but don't network for the sake of networking. Have other goals in mind. Brandon asked the question, with regard to the first job, does networking have any impact whatsoever? So that people at the university already know that you a bit personally. It's a great question, Brandon, and I would encourage you to ask other senior colleagues because people have different opinions on this. And you will find people who will say, yes, it does matter. In my opinion, no. In my opinion, for that first job, they've got your packet, which includes your CV, it includes several of your papers, it includes the letters, and then they've got all these other packets from people. Now, I can imagine a scenario where they've got two candidates that are like balanced on a knife edge, right? It's like you and somebody else, and your CVs appear to be exactly the same. Your prospects for research and teaching seem to be almost exactly the same. And they're like, how do we choose between these two? And somebody can say, well, I actually met this person at a conference and they seem really nice. One can imagine that. In my experience, that never happens, right? And so it's based on kind of your productivity and how much kind of potential people see in you. And keep in mind that there are these various stages. So the only time that networking could possibly matter is for that first screening stage, because after that, you're actually presenting to them, all right? And they're actually meeting you and then, potentially going out to dinner with you in a small group. If you get a campus visit, they're going to meet with you one-on-one. So now they've got all of this additional better information to kind of see how socially inept we are, because we all are, because we're academics, right? To see whether you seem like a kind of person who would cause trouble or get along well with people. So in my opinion, and you will find people who differ on this, but in my opinion, for that first job, I just don't think that it matters very much. Would networking work indirectly? For example, I networked and became close or mentored with this person, and this person was that person. So again, in my opinion, not for the first job. So if you've got letters from people, your advisor and from other senior colleagues who have worked with you, and they're going to be telling people, how great you are to work with and how smart you are and all those kinds of things. And so the idea that there's this other like additional source of information that's coming in indirectly. Again, we can imagine a situation where we've only got one slot left at AMA, and here's these two candidates, and I'm not sure. Well, this person has said nice things about this person. We can imagine that would happen. Again, practically speaking, hardly ever, in my opinion, and in my experience. Okay, so don't network. So what can we do instead? As I've argued from the previous slides, you don't need professional networks. What you need is friends and acquaintances. Right? That's where you're going to get the benefit. It's people who feel close to you, who like you, so that when a spot opens up at their university or at a friend's university, they will say, you know who's great, you know who is smart and productive and would make a great colleague is this person who I'm good friends with, right? And so that should ultimately be our goal. It's not, hey, I talked to this guy once at a conference, they seem okay. Like that's not where most of the benefits of networking come from. It's the relationships that we have. So when people feel close to you. So there's where our arrow comes up. I have heard on more than one occasion and from more than one person that students are sometimes given the advice from their advisors that when you go to conferences, you need to hang out at the hotel bar after everything closes down. So everybody's going to go to their sessions, and then they're going to go out to dinner. And then after dinner, everybody recongregates in the hotel bar, because that's where the networking happens. And there's always going to be a bunch of like kind of senior people and established people there, and you need to meet them and kind of like socialize with them. And that's super important. I could not disagree with that advice stronger. I think you do not need to go and hang out at the hotel bar and socialize with senior faculty when you're a student. If you want to, great. Like if that's your thing, do it. Like if you love being social and this seems like a great time, then absolutely do it. I'm not trying to wave you off from it. But I know of instances where students have felt pressured to do that when it's not naturally something they would be inclined to do. And they were given the advice that that is important for their career. And I disagree with that completely, right? Again, because I don't think it matters very much for your first job, I don't think you need to like put yourself in a position where you are forced to socialize in a setting that makes you uncomfortable or that you are just not into. I am boring and I don't drink. So I would never hang out at the hotel bar, ever, like never once. And also I'm kind of old. And so I want to sleep when I go to hotel or when I go to conferences. I don't want to stay up until 3 a.m. drinking so that I can then wake up and present at 8:15 in the first session the next morning. So I just don't think that you need to do that. Again, if it's your thing, if you love it, then by all means. But I think that there is at least as much risk to students staying up till 2 drinking in the hotel bar as there is benefit to be had. Because you can form a reputation for what you unfortunately do when you've had too much to drink and it's late at night. All right. Lewis says, sometimes the hotel bar can be productive, especially, yes, absolutely. I'm not trying to warn you off of it. I am trying to give you permission to not do it if others are pressuring you to. The hotel bar can be just kind of a casual opportunity to meet new people. And again, if you're into that, then by all means do it. So that's great. But you shouldn't feel like you need to because it's vital to your career. That I strongly disagree with. I will note that all of these are my own personal opinions, right? I want to emphasize that again. You will find people who have different opinions. It would be valuable to you to gather those differing opinions and form an opinion for yourself. But I feel very strongly about each of these points. So how does one get to meet people? I'll hold off on those for a second. Because I'll get to some of that a little bit. And if I don't address it enough, then bring it up again towards the end, because those are important questions. All right. So what advice can I give you then? So in terms of this question of how do you meet people, I was struggling to think of alternative ways of meeting people other than conferences. Like your questions about like, how did I meet the people that I'm friends with? I think it was all at conferences. So go to conferences. Obviously that's hard now. Hopefully things will be back to normal at some point, but go to conferences to the extent that you can, to the extent that you've got budget for it and that you can, it's practical for you to do so. There's no substitute for conferences in terms of meeting people that I'm aware of, right? I don't know if DocSIG has talked about or has done kind of virtual social hour kind of things where we can just kind of meet on Zoom. I know that meeting on Zoom is awful, but it might be better than nothing. So, there might be opportunities within DocSIG to meet and kind of get to know people at more depth. As I've argued before, in my opinion, the most valuable people for you to meet at this stage in your career are other students, right? That is overwhelmingly was true for me. I met these people when they were students. And then together we moved into assistant professor stage, and then together we moved into associate professor stage. And now a lot of these people are in positions of power and are, their network value to me increased at the times in my life when it was useful to me professionally. But it wasn't because I was like trying to game out the system for the people who would most likely be useful to me later. These were just my friends. And then my friends became successful. Present at conferences whenever that is possible. A question popped up like how do you introduce yourself to people? Like that's hard. I'll have some advice on that, but that's rough. Just like walking up and talking to somebody cold. The first conference I went to, I presented a paper in a session, and it was well attended. And oh my gosh, it was amazing. I had so many people stopping to talk to me throughout the rest of the conference because they saw the presentation. So present your posters, present in competitive sessions, present in symposia, like present, because then people will have an excuse to talk to you. And that's a much easier way to meet people and get your name out there. So look for these opportunities to meet people, like, look for serendipity. You can occasionally meet people like waiting for the elevators in a conference, or you can email somebody if you got a question about a paper, and that can sometimes like start up. But also don't force those. Again, I worry sometimes that students get this message that you need to network, you need to develop that, and so there's just this desperate push to absolutely start conversations with people. And I think that can be harmful. So look for those opportunities, take them, but don't force them. Don't push them on anyone or someone else. I already mentioned this, but focus on your peer network, because that is where your friend network comes from. It's great to meet these senior people. A lot of them are very interesting, and most of them are very nice. Most of the people in our field are very nice and will be happy to talk to you. But in terms of your network, in terms of the thing that'll be most valuable to you personally and professionally, it's your friends. And so focus on making friends with other students. They're going to, on average, be much more approachable than the more senior people anyway. Treat people like people, not like assets. Again, our goal is not to capture people into our network. Our goal is to make friends. Our goal is to treat people well. In terms of how we do that, so this is a famous book. It's an old book. I think it was written in like the 1930s or something. My dad gave me this book when I was a teenager. He said this is one of the most influential things that he read. And it's really interesting. It's a short read, lots of stories. It's very interesting. But Dale Carnegie kind of interviewed a lot of successful people and asked them what made them successful. And he developed all these rules for how we can win friends, how we can influence people, how we can lead. I'm just going to show you the ones around making people like you. Be genuinely interested in the other person. Right? So sometimes when we go into a conversation, we feel like it's our job to dazzle, and we need to come off as super smart, and we need to present ourselves well. Far more important that the other person feels smart and feels funny and feels like they've contributed something. That will make them like you. Smile, remember a person's name. This is less of an issue in a small field where everybody wears name tags to conferences, but still very nice. People like to have their name remembered. Here are the important ones. Be a good listener, encourage people to talk about themselves. Again, he's got this great story in the book where he talks about engagements that he has with people where he hardly says a word other than asking them questions about themselves. And then later someone will report what a great conversationalist that person thinks that he is. Right? If you can have an interaction with somebody where they're mostly talking about them, where you're talking about them and they're talking about them, they will come away from that feeling like you are an amazing conversationalist, that you are just so great at this back and forth. Pardon me. Because we all have these kind of needs. We want people to understand us. We want people, and so if you can service that need for somebody else, they appreciate that. That's really valued. Talk in terms of the other person's interests. So ask people. It's fascinating to me to ask academics about their hobbies, because academics have some really weird hobbies. We tend to all be slightly obsessive and throw themselves into whatever it is that we do, and people generally like talking about it. So ask people about themselves and try to be genuinely interested in them. Try to find something that you are generally interested in and let them talk about it, and then make the other person feel important. These are the bits of advice, and I back these up. I think these are great pieces of advice. All right, so advice is on actually meeting people and breaking that ice. A friend of a friend is always a much better way to meet someone than a cold introduction. So as your network grows, the opportunities for meeting more people grows, right? And so, you might be afraid to approach this person, or it might be difficult to approach this senior person whose work you admire and who's been around for forever. But, if you make a friend and then that friend is friends with the student of this person, then all of a sudden it's the easiest thing in the world, where this person who's this friend or a friend of a friend who says, oh, have you met my colleague, this person? And that's a good way to meet people. Always have an objective in mind. even if the objective is just getting to know someone. So especially if we're in kind of these large group settings, like where we're all just kind of having drinks and chatting and talking around, we can sometimes get caught in these conversations that kind of go nowhere. Try to have a goal, like try to have something that we want to get out of it, and then use that goal to guide the conversation. Not everything we talk about needs to be research. I actually find this kind of tedious. Obviously, research is something we all have in common, especially if we're talking at conferences. And so, it's natural to want to talk about that. Oh, what are you working on now? What's your dissertation on? But I think I've got this. Nobody's as excited about your research as you are, right? And so the idea that they ask because they're dying to know and they want to know every detail of it. No, they're mostly being polite, right? And so I would, refine your elevator pitch on this and give them the headline findings and what you're excited about. And if they want to know more, they'll ask. But we don't need to just talk about research, right? If we're looking to make these human connections, most of that is not about research. And there are people in the field who I know who will only ever talk about research, and I kind of avoid conversations with them because it's wearying, right? I like talking about research. I love research, but if that's the only thing that we've got to talk about, it's going to be a short conversation. Respect time and be aware of social cues. Again, this is a little awkward for me to kind of explicitly say, but I thought it was important because I have sometimes been trapped in a conversation with a well-meaning person for 20 minutes where I was wishing it was just a 5-minute conversation instead, right? This is, and again, so I'm going to show you this, and this is going to be, I'm going to dial this back a little bit, but first let me explain this to you. So this comes from a book called How to Become Famous in 2 Weeks or Less, that just has a bunch of random advice. A friend of mine pointed this to me, and this is one of the bits of advice. Knowing how much talk time people will allocate you before they start looking bored. When Jennifer Tilly started out in Hollywood, she knew that she was a 30-second girl. That's how much she can converse with the big power players for only that long. As she became more famous, she was promoted to 1.5 minutes of people's time. And at the present, she says she clocks in at a solid 3 minutes of face time. Right? So here's Jennifer Tilly. She was actually nominated for an Oscar for Bullets Over Broadway. More recently, she's been in the Chucky horror movie franchises. So this is advice for Hollywood. This is not advice for academia. Hollywood has very vertical power structures. In academia, it's much more flat. So even the fanciest of senior professors, they're not like a Hollywood producer. Like, they tend to be very nice and they're very happy to talk to people. But it's also true that anybody that we talk to that we don't know at the conference, probably there's other stuff that they wanted to do, right? That there are friends that they want to catch up with. There may be meetings they want to get to. And so I would encourage all of us, and I do this too, still to this day, I want to be very sensitive to the fact that somebody that I'm talking to might have something else that they want to do. And so, like, going into it, not going into it in the way that Jennifer Tilly lays out here, where you decide, oh, I'm only worth 30 seconds of somebody's time. That's not why I'm showing you this quote. But I think that the broad advice is good. I think recognizing that other people have other stuff going on. And if you can make a great impression in 2 minutes and then be kind of out and on your way, that will do you so much better than, hanging in there for an awkward 12-minute conversation when neither of you knows how to end it and they're too polite to tell you to go away. Right? So be brief, especially if it's a first interaction. We've got a long career ahead of us. We can build on that in the future, but don't kind of overstay the social cues there. I think this is the last slide of advice that I've got. So in network theory, there's this discussion about, you've got these nodes and then you've got these edges connecting the nodes. Sometimes when people talk about networking, especially when they go into it with the idea that I want to network, as I mentioned, it can be really predatory, where the idea is like, I've captured you and now you're in my network. And I think that they assume that those networks are unidirectional, like Facebook, like, oh, now we're Facebook friends, and so you're going to see everything that's on my feed and I'm going to see the stuff that's on your feed, and we're in the same network. and that's just not how relationships work. Like, if I meet some very senior established person who's been around for forever, that may be a very meaningful interaction for me, and I may consider that person in my network now, like we know each other. The person may have no memory of having ever met me because it was just kind of a passing thing and they met 24 people at that conference. So the idea that we can form these networks where the edges only go one direction, like I consider you part of my network, but you don't consider me part of your network. That kind of network structure does you no good, right? And so it has to be something where both of us kind of consider each other friends or acquaintances and view our relationship mutually from that perspective. To get the most out of your network, be generous to your network. I actively share teaching materials with all kinds of friends and acquaintances because I want to be viewed as a valuable partner in those networks, and realize that I feel more comfortable asking for things in exchange, and people feel more comfortable giving me things in exchange, if that's the kind of open, generous relationship that we have among all of us. I'm very careful to not talk negatively about people within my network. I want people to feel confident that if I am saying anything about them, that it is positive and effusive, right? And so, that if you get a reputation for somebody who says negative things about other people, that's going to damage the usefulness of your network. So contribute, be generous. But this is another thing that comes out of that Dunbar research. The strength of relationships is overwhelmingly determined by time together, time in contact. So if you want a strong relationship with people, then part of that is just putting in the time. And that may be, emails, it may be Zoom calls, it'll be hopefully face-to-face interactions in the near future. But it's just hard to substitute for just putting in the time. And that's what determines a lot of the kind of how far out you are in those concentric circles, is just how much time you spend with people. And then I think this is the last bit of advice that I have. I mentioned that the friends that I made when we were all students have, now they're journal editors and associate editors and in, positions of power within institutions and societies and all that kind of stuff. That wasn't my reason for befriending them. But kind of recognizing that we're all on this escalator where our positions are kind of changing over time. Don't neglect the people who are also students, because they will not always be students. Becoming close friends with them now is the best way to have, the best, strongest network down the road, right? So play that long game and look for those opportunities. All right. Now we can open up to questions. So I will handle one or two from the chat, and I encourage you to pop more in there as they come about. So Khalid asked about options for dinners. If you can manage it at all, try to avoid one-on-one dinners. Like, this is not always a choice that you have, like, especially when you're on the market. Sometimes, like, if you go to a school that has a small number of faculty, like, you might have to, but it's so much easier to carry on conversations when there's 2 or more people or 3 or more people kind of in the setting. So that's one bit of information that I have. It's useful at dinners if there's preparation for it, to do a little research about the people, right? So especially if you're interviewing on the job market, and you're going to go out to dinner with these people, like, look up a few of the recent papers, kind of read up a little bit about them, ask friends if they know anything about this person. Again, definitely talk about your research, but then also try to make these more human connections and have opportunities to talk about non-research stuff as well. Marina, I've been told that asking people about their research and what they study is a good way to make small talk. How do you do that if it's a more established scholar? I feel strange asking an established scholar about their research because I feel like I should already know if there's just an established scholar. But at the same time, I don't know. So, yeah, I'm not a huge fan of small talk. One thing to do is to ask people what they're working on now, because you shouldn't be expected to know that. And most people are working on something now, and people tend to be more excited about what they're working on now than they are about what they were working on in the past. So if you want to talk about their old stuff, usually it would be in the line of like, oh, I'm working on something similar. And so can you tell me about where that idea came from? Or have you thought about this kind of angle on it? Again, go back to those tips. Like, people mostly want to talk about themselves. So if you want to talk to them about research, frame it in such a way where it's like, well, what can you tell me about your research? As opposed to a way where I think you're worried that they're going to like grill you about their research. And, that'll happen. There are people who are very egotistical about their research and their accomplishments. Mostly it won't. Mostly people are real good about that kind of stuff. But, to the extent that you can ask them about their thoughts and feelings about it, and like, oh, where did you even get that data set? Or like, where did you get the idea for that? That was such a great idea. Then that might be kind of a way to make small talk around their research interests. Or, don't talk to them about their research interests. I heard that you're an avid runner. Like, how'd you get into running, right? These are also things that people like to talk about. Would you recommend making friends with people from different research groups? Yes, I absolutely would. So it's hard. You kind of need to go out of your way to do it, because most of the conferences that you go to will be research stream specific, right? So if you're a CB researcher, you will tend to go to consumer behavior conferences. And then even within those conferences, a lot of times you'll be going to the sessions that are related to your research interests. So it's natural to form those relationships around the kind of mode of research that you do and the topics that you're interested in. But I absolutely think it's useful. A lot of times, a quant colleague might know that their school is looking to hire CB or vice versa. And so make friends. Like, there are lovely people across all the different disciplines, and I have some great quant friends and some great managerial or strategy friends. So yeah, look for those kind of human connections first. It is useful to have friends within the discipline that you're in. All right, they'll be better sources for going for help for analyses or kind of gossip related to specific journals that you are going to be targeting, that kind of thing. But yeah, by all means, definitely don't discriminate on that. There are lots of great people who can be wonderful additions to your network. It might be able to help you with things like teaching and other kind of non-research aspects of the job. Any advice for introverts? Yes, I am off the chart introverted. So when I go to, and again, introverted doesn't mean you're shy. Introverted means that interactions with other people kind of drain you of energy. And so when I go to a conference, I spend a non-trivial amount of time alone in my room watching crappy TV shows because I need that time to recharge. I've been in conferences before where I will step out of kind of hanging out at the bar and just go to the other side of the lobby and sit alone in a chair and read for a little while because I need that time. So it can absolutely be done. It's very natural to be intimidated by walking into a room full of people that you don't know, even if you're extroverted, and trying to strike up a conversation. I would suggest go and find another student who looks just as terrified as you and start there, instead of walking up to the journal editor and starting there. Because those scared students are going to see what you are doing as a kindness as opposed to an imposition. And again, I don't want to paint senior people in the field in a negative light. Most people are wonderful and very nice and would be happy to talk to you. But if you're introverted, if it's intimidating, start with colleagues, start with fellow students. And once you know that other person, then now you're not alone. And now the two of you can start to rope in other people, or they can introduce you to friends of theirs that they have. Do you have any advice for how best to approach senior researchers or peer level researchers when looking for a co-author? A little bit. So the best approach to getting a co-author, especially if it's a more senior co-author, remember that people are trying to optimize their time and use it in the best way that they can. So if you go to somebody and say, hey, I've got an idea for a project and this is kind of where it is, like, okay, like maybe that seems like it's got a lot of potential. It also seems like, some risk. And then it also seems like some amount of time and effort on my part. If you go to somebody and say, hey, I've got this idea for the project, we've already got this data that we've analyzed and the effect appears to be robust, or we've already got this data set that we've been working on and the initial modeling is very promising. Right? Now you're dramatically reducing the risk and the amount of kind of time and effort that this person's going to need to put into the project before they even know whether it's going to work out. So my advice would be, if you're going to talk to a more senior person or a peer about co-authoring on a project, kind of the more that you bring to the table initially, the easier it's going to be for them to say yes, right? Other things that reduce that risk, if it's in an area where they are already very active, right, then they might be more interested in kind of adding to that research stream. So those would be things that you can work on there. Let's see, any advice on developing and maintaining relationships after that initial conversation? You can follow up emails are good. Another thing is to, again, play that long game. If my goal is not to immediately have you in my network, but to just know that you're a friend of mine, in normal days, there are often multiple conferences a year. And so just make sure that every time you're at a conference, you specifically seek that person out. And, hey, remember when we met 6 months ago or a year ago? How have things been going since then? But yeah, follow up, like once you kind of break that initial ice, like follow up emails or like, hey, I just read this article. I don't know if you've heard about it, but like, here it is, it's useful. Or I saw this in the New York Times and it seemed to be related to what you're doing, or I read this book. So there are opportunities then to follow on after that initial contact. Again, you don't want to come off as predatory. You don't want to come off as like, I'm doing this so that someday I can use you. It's in the aim of developing that friendship, so that if you're presenting them with something very useful, like hey, here's a newspaper article that you could potentially use as the introduction to your paper, because I know it's about this. So this is an interesting example of, I think, what you're studying. Like, that's always going to be well received. People are going to love to hear about you from that. Or follow up on personal stuff like, hey, remember you saying your kid was sick? Are they doing better now? Anything along those lines, I think, are ways that you can kind of follow up. Or again, just look for them again in conferences to follow up around that.
I think not to cut you off, but I think we may
Please
do one more question just to be conscious of your time, because we are coming up on the hour mark here. So we'll maybe pick one more question and then we'll wrap up.
Sounds good. All right. Let me skim these real quick. See, so in terms of large conferences versus small conferences, I don't have strong opinions about that. I would say go to conferences. So if the only conferences that you can go to within your budgets and within your kind of time scale are the smaller ones, go to those. If it's easier for you to go to the larger ones, go to those. Go to both if you can, right? If that's possible. The advantage of smaller conferences is I think that there are kind of tighter relationships that are formed over the short term in those conferences, because there's just nowhere to escape, right? And so you're kind of forced to interact with more of those people more often. The advantage of the larger conferences is you have a greater likelihood of kind of finding your people. So finding people that have the same sense of humor as you, or the same kind of research interests, or those kinds of things. So I don't think that one is necessarily better than the other. Go to both if you can. Go to as many conferences as you can reasonably do. I think that's the primary means for building networks and building friendships within our field. So do it if you can.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hamilton. It's funny that you started off talking about how you may not be the person to talk about networking, but I wholeheartely disagree, because I think you've demystified some of this that a lot of doctoral students, I think, get told, like you said, and just from firsthand experience, like overstaying your welcome at the bar can be very counterproductive, because some of the most like painful, seared into my memory events is when I've overstayed my welcome at like a bar type scenario, and it becomes extraordinarily awkward, and then you just have to kind of like limp away back to your corner of like doctoral peers. So
don't beat yourself up too much about that. You and literally everybody else, like we've all been there. So,
and so I think that was a really good approach to this webinar. So we really appreciate your time, your thoughts. This is going to be recorded and posted to the AMA DocSIG YouTube channel for everyone to either share or come back and take notes of. In the chat, I did put the reminder for all the DocSIG Winter AMA events along with my email. So feel free to email me with any additional questions. And we're getting a lot of very positive response already. So again, Dr. Hamilton, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your thoughts on this. And I look forward to seeing everyone at the next DocSIG webinar on February 1st. Thank you all.